How many of you have had sleep problems? Maybe it's waking up in the middle of the night and then not being able to get back to sleep, or waking up too early, or nodding off regularly in front of the TV, or more embarrassingly during work meetings. One thing's for sure, our modern world means that we're not sleeping in the way we used to. As my guest today, Derk-Jan Dijk, says, we are the only species to extend our day using artificial light, and that has consequences. Derk-Jan Dijk is now Distinguished Professor of Sleep and Physiology at the University of Surrey and Director of the Surrey Sleep Centre. He moved to Guildford after giving up a faculty position at Harvard University over 2 decades ago to set up his research programme. And the work has been remarkably fruitful, in part because he shunned the traditional silo mentality of specialism in one field of science and instead combined physics with physiology, genetics and psychology. Over the course of his distinguished career, he studied many aspects of how we sleep, such as how circadian rhythms interact with our sleep cycles, the role of genes in the timing of our bedtimes, and how sleep changes in people with dementia. I also want to find out if I can trust what my Fitbit tells me about the quality of my sleep. Derk-Jan Dijk, welcome to the Life Scientific.
Thank you, Jim.
Now, these days it seems to me that we're all more aware of the way our sleep affects our health, how much we need, of what quality it is. Over your 30 or so years of research, how has your knowledge of the underlying mechanisms of sleep changed?
Well, over the 30 years, many things have happened. First of all, as you already mentioned, our awareness of the importance of sleep has increased tremendously, and I've been witnessing this. And that was remarkable. In terms of, how my knowledge has changed in respect to the importance of sleep and the mechanisms of sleep. Most importantly, I think the fact that our biological clock plays a very important role in sleep regulation. And back in the 1970s and later, the neuroanatomical basis of circadian rhythms was discovered, and people started to accept that part of sleep timing is regulated by a very robust biological mechanism in the brain. And that helped people to accept that sleep timing really was a biological phenomenon that needed to be taken seriously and wasn't just something that you could choose at will. And some of my research areas have been focusing on those biological mechanisms underlying sleep.
We're going to talk about some of these discoveries that you've made over the years, Derk-Jan, but let's take you back to where it all started. You were born and brought up in the Netherlands on a farm, and you had an early interest, perhaps not surprisingly, in agricultural sciences. So how is it that you became interested in the study of sleep?
Well, as you mentioned, I grew up in a rural area, and my early years were embedded in nature, if you want to phrase it in that particular way. In secondary school, I became interested in biology, and then I had to decide whether I was going to an agricultural university or study biology. I decided to study biology at the University of Groningen. During the undergraduate studies, there was a course on biological rhythms, and the lecturer was Serge-Daan, and he was a pioneer in chronobiology, and I was fascinated by the topic. I was fascinated because some of the phenomenon could be described with principles that were borrowed from oscillator theory in physics. And the application of those quantitative methods to describe biological phenomena, I felt was very interesting. I was lucky enough to be recruited to a PhD project. Serge-Daan, together with collaborators of him, a psychiatrist van den Hoofdoctor and a physicist, were awarded a grant to look into sleep regulation. And it was my task to do so under their supervision.
Before we move on, you can just very briefly define exactly what chronobiology is. I mean, I know it's made up of 2 words, chrono, time, and biology, but what does it mean in your field?
Chronobiology can be described as the study of temporal phenomena in biological systems. when we talk about circadian biology, we talk about rhythmicity with a period of approximately 24 hours. But there are rhythms that have a much shorter period like the non-REM cycle, which occurs during sleep, which has a period of 90 minutes. So chronobiology, in essence, covers all these periods. Circadian biology focuses on rhythms with a period of 24 hours. And central to the study of chronobiology or circadian biology is trying to discover to what extent these periodicities in physiology and behavior are driven by the environment, like the light-dark cycle, the extent to which they are driven by internal time-generating mechanisms, and how they interact with other regulatory systems.
Well, after your PhD at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands and a stint doing research in Zurich, you went to Harvard, where there was another of the pioneering sleep researchers.
Yes, I went to Harvard Medical School, the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and there was a sleep and chronobiology group which was headed up by a researcher named Charles Andrew Zeisler. And he already published in the 1980s important papers on how the circadian clock influenced sleep. I met him at a meeting back in 1987. I think it was in a church in Leiden, and I had heard him speak and he had heard me speak, and he invited me to come to Boston. But then I first spent a few years in Zurich. The impressive and still amazing thing about the laboratory he created was that you could study volunteers 24 hours per day, not just for a day or a week, but you could do experiments lasting 6 weeks or even longer. And during those periods, people were drawing blood samples. People were conducting a test to measure cognitive performance, and of course, sleep was also recorded. And that particular ability to do those kind of experiments was and is very impressive, and really allowed us to describe those phenomena in detail, and also do experiments that pointed to particular aspects of the circadian regulation of sleep.
Well, it was while still at Harvard that you made a fascinating and apparently paradoxical discovery that circadian rhythms and sleep cycles aren't working together. Could you explain that work to me?
Yeah, well, we made a discovery which was somewhat surprising, but also explained some results that had been in the literature and people found difficult to understand. When you talk about the regulation of sleep and wake by a biological clock, you would say, okay, the biological clock wakes you up in the morning and sends you to sleep in the evening. So a signal coming from the biological clock that would be an indicator of the drive to be awake would be expected to be very strong in the morning. After all, it needs to wake you up. We did experiments that allowed us to look into this in great detail. And much to our surprise, what we found was that the circadian drive to be awake was actually strongest in the evening, at around 10 o'clock in the evening. And that, of course, sounds very paradoxical.
Yeah, because that's when your body should be telling you to go to sleep.
Now, the reason we found this was because we used a complicated protocol in which participants, they first slept, let's say, from 11 to 7, and then subsequently we asked them, or we told them, to go to bed 4 hours later every day. And the biological clock, as indexed by, for example, that melatonin rhythm, cannot follow that 28-hour period. Now, your sleepiness, as we probably will accept, depends on time of day and how long you have been awake, or how much sleep you got in the previous evening. So in that forced desynchrony protocol, as it is called, we could separate the influence related to time awake and time asleep from the influence of the circadian clock. And now it starts maybe becoming sense, because in the course of a 16-hour day, you have been awake longer and longer. So that wake duration dependent signal to become sleepy becomes stronger. If you want to stay awake for 16 hours, something needs to counteract that wake duration dependent increase in sleepiness. And that signal that helps you to stay awake for 16 hours comes from the circadian clock. And that's why that drive for wakefulness needs to increase as the biological day progresses, so that it cancels out the increase in sleepiness related. So it's and that of course makes complete sense, but it wasn't recognized. So it's not a simple alarm clock. It's much more of a system that consolidates behavior.
And this biological clock, the circadian pacemaker, this is in our brains, in this part of the brain, the cells and well, that's basically, as you say, if that didn't work, if that wasn't working, we just get gradually sleepier and sleepier throughout the day, so the longer we're awake.
Well, actually, what is happening when you remove that circadian clock, and you can remove it in different ways. You can remove it by electrolytic lesions. You can also now remove it by knocking out some of the genes that generate those circadian rhythms. But if you, in those preparations and organisms without a circadian clock, look at sleep-wake timing, you see, for example, in humans, that those people can't stay awake for 16 hours. What actually happens is they are awake for a couple of hours and then they have to go to sleep because there is no circadian signal that counteracts that wake dependent. And there are cases in the literature of people who had a tumor near the SCN, which is the locus of that central circadian pacemaker. And then indeed you see these very short sleep-wake cycles.
Well, in 1999, Derk-Jan, you decided to leave Harvard and the US to take up a lectureship at the University of Surrey. What was the attraction of Guildford over Boston?
Well, it wasn't necessarily in the first place the attractiveness of Guildford. While we were in Boston, we were thinking about our future and decided to go back to Europe. So the main goal